In this video, we look at using AVD with Azure Private Link. Hello everyone, I'm Travis and this is Xeraltos. In this video, we review using Private Link with AVD and then walk through deploying it in a lab. Before that, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend, and click the bell icon for notifications of new content. Check out my courses on Azure Virtual Desktop, Hybrid Identities with Windows AD and Entra ID, and Windows 365 with Intune Management. The links are below. And thank you, channel members. Your support is appreciated. Back to it. Let's start by reviewing what a private link is. Most Azure services, including AVD, are available over the public internet, but we may want to limit some services so they're not available over the internet. Take a storage account, for example. By default, they're available over the internet, but maybe we're hosting sensitive data that should never be available online. Private access options for storage, AVD, and other PaaS services are available. Private Link uses Microsoft's network to access PaaS services. All customer network traffic inside or between Azure data centers is encrypted with IEEE 802.1ae Max Security, also known as MACsec. This prevents man-in-the-middle attacks as well as any snooping or wiretapping attacks. It's how we know data transferred in Azure is safe. We can use Private Link instead of the internet to access services securely, but we need a way to connect those services designed for public internet access to our private virtual network in Azure. To do that, Azure places a virtual network interface card or NIC on a private network that connects to an Azure PaaS service. This is called a private endpoint. A private endpoint NIC gets an IP address for the virtual network and then can be accessed by any client that can route to that virtual network without going over the public internet. By using a private link with AVD, we can keep all or some AVD traffic off the public internet and keep it on the private network. We could use this in secure environments where all clients have private connectivity to the session host. They could be in Azure or connected to the private virtual network over ExpressRoute or VPN. RDP ShortPath can use a private network, but even with RDP ShortPath, the initial connection, called the Reverse Connect Transport, starts over the public internet. RDP ShortPath is opportunistic. If the private connection fails, it'll revert back to the public connection. Using RDP ShortPath is not supported with Private Link. You may be able to use ShortPath for managed networks. ShortPath using Stun or Turn is not supported. So how does it work? Well, we just add private endpoints to our virtual network that connect to the AVD service. Okay, maybe that's oversimplifying it a bit. There are three workflows we need to address with AVD and Private Links. Let's consider the steps a client takes to connect to AVD. First is the initial feed discovery. After a sign-in, the AVD client checks the initial feed discovery to identify all the workspaces assigned to the user. Next is the feed download. After the clients discover its assigned workspaces, it uses the feed download from those workspaces to get a list of all the application the user can access. Then there's the connection to the host pool. There are two sides to this. The session hosts and the clients need to connect to the gateway service to orchestrate the connection. We need to add a private endpoint that connects each of these workflows with Private Link. However, we don't need to enable it on all three workflows. We can partially enable Private Link. The supported scenarios include using a Private Link to connect to a host pool. With this option, we can require Private Link for just the session host or the session host and the client. We can enable Private Link for a connection to the host pool and the connection to the feed download. And we can use Private Link for all three, the connection to the host pool, feed download, and the initial feed discovery. Let's look at each workflow more closely. The initial feed discovery is global. There can only be one private endpoint for an entire AVD deployment. One note with the initial feed discovery, the recommendation is to create a workspace dedicated to this private endpoint because it's global. It's the feed discovery for all host pools. If the workspace is removed, the initial feed discovery will stop working and clients won't be able to connect. The feed download is the property of a workspace. It returns all the applications that a user has access to in that workspace. Each workspace that uses Private Link will get its own private endpoint. And finally, the connection to the host pool. Each host pool that uses Private Link will get its own private endpoint. Let's review the demo environment before we jump in and configure Private Link. We have a host pool deployed and attached to a virtual network. There's also a client and a domain controller used for DNS in the same virtual network. Any client that uses private endpoints needs private network access to AVD. That could be on a different VNet with VNet peering or on premises with ExpressRoute or VPN. Be sure the virtual network has enough IP addresses available. In my lab, 4 IP addresses were used for each host pool, 2 for each workspace feed, and 1 for the initial feed. Coming up, we'll start by re-registering the desktop virtualization service on the subscription, then add private endpoints for the host pool, workspace feed, and initial feed. Let's jump into the portal to get started. Here we are in the Azure portal. Before configuring Private Link for AVD, we need to re-register the Microsoft.desktop virtualization resource provider on each subscription we want to use AVD Private Link with. Let's go to the subscription, select your subscription, go to Settings, Resource Providers, and find Microsoft.desktop virtualization. We'll select that and re-register. Once it's been re-registered, we can move on. Let's go to AVD. We'll create the first private link connection on a host pool. This is required for each host pool that uses private link. We'll go to the host pool in Azure Virtual Desktop. Then go to Networking. And go to Private Endpoint Connections. From here, we'll create a new private endpoint. Make sure the subscription and resource group are selected and give it a name. AVD Priv Link PEP for this example, and that matches the name of the host pool. The network interface name is created for you, and make sure that the region selected is the same as the virtual network we're connecting it to. Go next to Resource. That defaults to the target sub-resource of connection. This indicates the type of resource we're connecting to the private endpoint. There's only one option. Go next to Virtual Networks. Select the VNet and the subnet that we want to attach the private endpoint to. That will create a virtual NIC that attaches to a subnet. It doesn't need to be on the same subnet as the session host, but there does need to be connectivity from the client and the session host to the VNet. Let's leave the rest and go to DNS. Leave it set to integrated DNS zones and go next to tags. We'll take a look at DNS coming up shortly. Add tags as needed and go to Review and Create. And once validation passes, click Create. This will take a minute to finish. I'll pause here and come back once it's done. That finished, and once created, we still have to limit access to the host pool to only the private endpoint. So let's go back to the host pool. Go to Networking under Settings. It's set to allow access from all networks, public and private. We can also allow public access to end users, but private for session hosts. Use this if we want to use Private Link, but the clients are not on a private network. The user side of the connection is allowed over the public internet. For this example, we'll set the third option, disable public access and only use private access. With this configuration, the clients have to be on a private network, routable to the VNet where our session hosts are. We'll click Save, and that updates the settings. Remember, we need to do this for every host pool we want to use with private endpoints. Next, we'll create a private endpoint for the feed download. This needs to be added for every workspace that we use with Private Link. We'll go to Workspaces. Next, open the workspace we're adding the Private Link to. And go to Networking under Settings. Go to Private Endpoint, and we'll add a new private endpoint. Just like before, it selects our resource group and subscription. We're going to give it a name. The name is the same as the workspace with a PEP at the end for a private endpoint. It created a network interface name for us and selected the region. Let's go to Resource. Select the target sub-resource type of feed. There can be multiple feed sub-resources. We can use one for each workspace that hosts application groups that we want to use private endpoints with. There can only be one global target sub-resource. We'll set that up next. Go to Virtual Networks. Select the VNet and subnet for the private endpoint. And again, be sure the clients have network connectivity to the subnet we're placing the private endpoint on. We'll leave the rest and go to DNS. We can leave the default integrated with private DNS selected, go to Tags, add tags as needed, then Review and Create, and Create. This will set up our second private endpoint. This also will take a minute to finish. I'll pause here and come back once it's done. That finished. And next, we have to limit access to the feed we just created the private endpoints for. We'll go back to the workspace. Go to Networking under Settings. We have the option to allow access from all public or private networks, or we can disable public access, so we just use private access. We're going to select that option, Disable Public Access. Click Save. Next, we're going to create the initial feed discovery private link. Before we do that though, let's create a new empty workspace. The initial feed discovery is a global service. There can only be one in each AVD deployment. If the workspace is deleted, clients won't be able to connect to AVD. Creating a dedicated workspace limits the risk of accidental deletion. We're going to create a new workspace, select your subscription and the resource group we're going to place it in. Give it a name, Initial Feed Discovery WS for this example. Give it a friendly name and a description, and select the region. Go next to Application Groups, and there will be no application groups in this workspace. Go next to Advanced. Enable diagnostic settings if needed. Go to Tags. Also add tags if needed. Then Review and Create. Once validation passes, click Create. We'll give it a minute to finish. Once finished, we'll go to the resource. And here again, we'll open Networking under Settings. Go to Private Endpoints, and we'll add a private endpoint. And here again, just like the other ones, select your subscription and resource group, give it a name, and verify the correct region is selected, the region of the VNet we're attaching it to. Go to Resource. We'll select the target sub-resource type of global. And as stated previously, there can only be one global target sub-resource type in an AVD deployment. Go next to Virtual Network. Select the VNet and the subnet for the endpoint. And just like the other two, be sure all AVD clients can access the subnet we're placing the private endpoint on. Go next to DNS. We'll leave it as default, integrated with private DNS zones. Go to Tags, add tags as needed, and Review and Create. Once validation passes, Create. And here again, this will take a few minutes. I'll pause the video here and come back once it's finished. That finished, let's go back to the workspace. We'll go to Networking under Settings. We have the option to allow public and private or just private access. However, this setting is ignored when the workspace uses the global sub-resource type. It will always be both public and private. We have our private endpoints in place, but we still need to address DNS. Before we do that, let's try to connect to AVD from a computer connected to the private network. If we close and reopen our desktop client or do a refresh, it shows that our resource can't be accessed from this network. Why is that? We're on a client on the private network, and we required connectivity over the private link in the networking settings, but we haven't configured our internal DNS servers for the AVD private link zones. All the DNS lookups are returning public, not private IPs. So this client is trying to access those resources over the public internet. Let's take a look at our private endpoints. Let's search for a private link. We'll go to private link. That opens up the private link center. Go to private endpoints. Here are the 3 private endpoints we set up, and one for a storage account. You can ignore that. Notice it lists the IP, resource, target sub-resource, the subnet it's attached to, and the connection state is approved. Let's open AVD private link PEP. This is for the host pool. And if we go to DNS configuration, here are the DNS records for the private endpoint. If we scroll down a little bit to private DNS zone, the zone is privatelink.wvd.microsoft.com. That's the private DNS zone. We need our internal DNS to be authoritative for that zone or pass the DNS lookups to Azure to resolve it to a private IP address. That domain will return private IPs, not public IPs. For an example, I'm going to copy the host with the domain rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com and use that for testing in a minute. Let's go back to the private endpoints. Let's go to private link WS PEP next. This is the private endpoint for the workspace. We'll go to DNS configuration again. Here are the DNS records for that private endpoint. That has the same private DNS zone, privatelink.wvd.microsoft.com. For testing, I'll copy the rdbroker.wvd.microsoft.com FQDN. We're going to use these in a second. Let's go back to private endpoints. And this time we'll open up initial feed WSPEP. We'll go to DNS configuration. We see the same thing, only the private DNS zone is privatelink-global.wvd.microsoft.com. We need our internal DNS servers to be authoritative for this zone as well, or forward the request to the zone to Azure to resolve the host name to private IP addresses. For this example, I'll use rdweb.wvd.microsoft.com. Let's try to resolve those 3 fully qualified domain names from a computer on the private network, which just happens to be the same computer I'm working on. Let's open up NSLookup. And let's try to resolve the first fully qualified domain name from the host pool. It's using the internal DNS server, but we're getting a public IP address. Notice also there's an alias with the privatelink.wvd.microsoft.com domain. If DNS is authoritative for that zone, it will use that and return the private IP. Let's do it again, this time with that workspace fully qualified domain name. Same thing, it's using the internal DNS server, returning a public IP, but has a privatelink.wvd.microsoft.com alias. And let's try the last fully qualified domain name we got from the initial link feed. This one happened to be rdweb. I'm just using these domain names as an example. There's really nothing specific about them. Same thing, internal DNS, public IP, but it has a privatelink-global.wvd.microsoft.com alias. Let's update DNS next. I need to pause at this point. The steps I'm outlining here are intended to help you identify whether DNS is configured properly. However, it's unlikely the steps I take in this lab to configure DNS for Private Link are the same you'll use in your environment. DNS is complex and I can't address every scenario in this video. My environment is a lab on the same VNet as AVD. All I need to do is point my DNS server at the wire server IP address to resolve the private link zones. But that won't work consistently in environments with multiple VNets. A good solution for production is to integrate Azure DNS private resolvers with inbound endpoints and use that to resolve the private link zones. I have a video if you want more information on private resolvers and DNS. The links are below. Here we are on the DNS server. This is the DNS server that the client's using. Let's go into Properties and Forwarders. Let's go to Edit. For this, I'll remove the public Google DNS server and add the wire server IP address of 168.63.129.16. That's the wire server IP address. In Azure, it acts as DNS, DHCP, and provides other services on the VNet. Let's click OK, and we'll save that. Next, we'll restart the DNS server service to make sure that change takes effect. Let's go back to the client. Now let's run NSLookup again for the same 3 fully qualified domain names. First is the workstation. Now it uses the private link alias and it resolves to that private IP address. Next, we'll run it again with a fully qualified domain name from the feed. That also used the private link alias and returned the private IP address. Next is the fully qualified domain name from the initial feed. That used the private link-global.wvd.microsoft.com alias and returned the private IP address as well. The steps here are meant to help you verify that DNS is working correctly. If you have issues with DNS, check out the video posted below on Azure DNS Private Resolver. As I stated previously, the changes made to DNS in my small lab are probably going to be different than the changes you'll need to make in larger environments. Next, let's see if we can refresh and connect to AVD. Here we are in the AVD client. Let's refresh. Great, that worked. If you have a problem at this point, try to close and reopen the client. You can even try to unsubscribe and then resubscribe to the feed. Now that we have the feed, let's try to connect over Private Link. And another note on troubleshooting. If you get a message that you can't connect because it requires a private endpoint connection, it's likely that the session host needs to be restarted. The session host may still be connected to AVD over the public internet. Restarting them will get the agent to connect over the private endpoint. That does it. We can now access AVD over our private network using private endpoints and Private Link. I hope that helps you better understand private links and AVD. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching.